Next, I'm going to talk about some of the empirical approaches that researchers use to conduct their studies. So we'll start by talking about surveys, case studies, observational studies, and tests, and then we'll move on to talking about correlational research and experiments. So when I say case study, what I'm talking about is, well, exactly what it sounds like. It's a study that's conducted with a small number of people. And so case studies were kind of the hallmark approach way back when in the field, like during Sigmund Freud's day and age. And so really the foundation of our field was built on case studies. And so there's certainly a lot of advantages to doing these types of studies. So the first is that it's a really good way to generate hypotheses. And so a case study may be a good first approach. So if you have a new research topic or a new research question, or maybe there's maybe a new theory that you're interested in testing, doing a case study first can be a great jumping off point, because even though there are some of the disadvantages we're going to talk about, it can still help us generate ideas and predictions. Probably the most obvious is that it can give us a lot of high detail information about the small number of people. Because if your case study has if your study has over 1,000 people in it, then you're not going to be able to learn a lot about each of those people. Whereas if you only have, let's say, 2 or 3 people, you can get a lot more information about those participants. It also allows you to be able to conduct studies on maybe more unusual cases or unusual phenomena. So, for example, trichotillomania is a psychological disorder where people pull their hair out. Sometimes they keep the hair and collect it. Sometimes they eat it. And so this is a very rare psychological disorder. So for example, I've only ever worked with one client with trichotillomania. And so because it's kind of an unusual psychological disorder, it probably means you're not going to be able to conduct large-scale studies. And so you can do a case study to try to get at least some baseline information about that psychological disorder. The disadvantages, I think, are also obvious. That it can be hard to collect all the information you need. Sometimes you might not ask all the right questions. For example, the person's memory might not be very accurate. It might be biased. They might be selective in what they share with you. That person is just that. It's an individual, so they're not representative of everyone, and it's possible that maybe they're just a little bit unusual compared to other individuals with that particular situation or disorder or whatever you're interested in studying. Case studies, you also end up working really closely with the participant, and so it's possible that the researcher would bias or influence the participant, and that's exactly what we saw with Sigmund Freud. A lot of his work ended up being flawed because participants felt pressured to give particular answers. And so some of the psychological approaches he used with his clients were not very effective, but he thought they were because people felt pressured to say that they were. So another approach that researchers use in psychology is naturalistic observation. And that's, again, exactly what it sounds like. It's where you observe people in a natural setting. And so one example of this is when I was doing my graduate work at Virginia Tech, some of my fellow graduate students did a naturalistic observation study out in the commuter parking lot. So they would stand by the exit of the commuter lot and they were recording whether or not the drivers were wearing a seatbelt and then also recording the gender of the driver. And so they were literally just standing on the side of the road with a clipboard and just watching people naturally exist the way they exist. And so the advantages here, well, first is that the behavior is occurring naturally. And so it's about as natural as you can get in terms of studying behavior. And so another advantage is that this often is a first step of research. So that was a great way for those researchers to get kind of initial ideas about are there gender differences in car safety behavior. A disadvantage, though, is that the researcher had very little control over the situation. So, for example, they stood by a stop sign hoping that that would give them more of an opportunity to see the driver. But as we know, not everyone stops very fully at stop signs. And so people were just rolling through the stop sign and they didn't really get a chance to get a good enough look at the person. The observations might also be biased. So researchers do everything they can to try to record things as honestly and as accurately as possible, but they're still people. They still have biases and assumptions. And so I know one thing that the researchers in that situation were worried about is that many of them held the kind of biased stereotype that women are safer drivers. And so they found that they had a tendency to assume that the female drivers were wearing a seatbelt, and so their results were actually a little bit biased. Laboratory observation, on the other hand, is when the observation occurs in a more controlled setting. So, for example, you could observe families in a clinic, for example. So you could invite families in, put them in this playroom with lots of different toys around them, and just tell the parents, interact with your kid like you normally do. And so then the researcher goes and hides behind a one-way mirror. So I've done that before, and I can tell you what happens. The parents look really uncomfortable. The kids often freaked out. They're in an unfamiliar setting with toys the kid's never seen. The parent knows that they're being observed, so they're going to put on their best parenting hat ever, right? So they're going to behave, as if they are parent of the year. And so the advantages here, well, you do have more control. So the researchers hiding behind a one-way mirror, they have a perfect view. The lighting's perfect. They get to kind of set the parameters. And maybe they could use more sophisticated equipment. Maybe they have the kid wear a microphone so that you can hear every little detail, or maybe you have a camera you can zoom in closer. You could even go as far as having the whole family wear heart rate monitors, and now you know the heart rates of everybody, while they're interacting. You can do anything you want because it's in a lab. There's no restrictions other than ethics, which we'll talk about later. Of course, the disadvantage is that maybe you can't control everything. So you're still just observing. You're not controlling the situation. And so, the kid might have a temper tantrum. The kid might wet his pants. There's all sorts of things that can still get in the way, even though you have more control than in a naturalistic observation setting. Your observations could still be biased. Maybe you have the assumption that, people that have more than one kid, maybe they're too overwhelmed to effectively parent each of the children. And so that observation might bias how you rate those parents in that situation versus if there's only one child in the family. It does not allow you to create firm conclusions about cause and effect, which we'll talk about in a minute. I guess spoiler alert, not to ruin the ending here, experiments are the only way that you can definitively demonstrate cause and effect. Okay, so that's a really important point to take away from chapter 2, is that experiments are the only way to demonstrate cause and effect. So lab observations don't work for that. The other thing, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning of my example, the behavior is probably going to differ from what would occur in a natural environment, right? The family knows they're being watched. It's a sterile lab setting, harsh lighting. It's not natural. And so it's hard to know exactly how what you see in that lab would transfer to real life. Psychological tests are another way that we can collect information from our participants. Typically, psychological tests involve asking them a series of questions, or showing them a series of questions on paper, or showing them a series of pictures. Typically, the psychological tests try to get at the thing of interest in kind of a camouflage around about, not direct way. And I think that'll be more clear in a second. And so with psychological tests, we might be measuring things like personality. So the advantage is we can get a ton of information. We can measure how they feel. We can measure what abilities they have, and maybe try to predict career paths or educational achievement. But the problem is that many of these tests have questionable reliability and validity. And I will talk about reliability and validity in a minute, but let me throw out some examples first, so I think I can set it up better that way. So here's an example of what we call a projective personality test. So there's projective tests, and then there's objective tests. And so the projective test, this is probably the most famous. I think you've probably heard of this. It's more kind of commonly called the Inkblot test, but the more formal name is the Rorschach. And so what we used to do was we would show one of these pictures at a time and ask the client just to kind of say the first thing that came to mind. And so the kind of most common responses for this one, participants would say they see a bat. Another common response is the face of like a wolf or a dog. This one, people tended to focus in on like pieces and parts of the picture. A lot of people saw high heel shoes down here. Some people saw like the neck and head of like a swan or a goose. Sometimes people saw like an animal hanging upside down here, like a bat. And so I'm hoping you're picking up on the issues here, because just because someone sees a wolf face versus a bat versus a Halloween mask versus anything else, a moth, what does that tell us about that person and their personality and any psychological difficulties they might be experiencing? We don't know. And so these tests were big during Sigmund Freud's day and age. These were really big in terms of like psychoanalysis as an approach. So where we would try to analyze someone, we analyze dreams. These are very heavily based on unconscious drives and conflicts. And so the field's really moved away from that because there are huge issues with reliability and validity, which again, I will talk more about here in a second. An objective test, on the other hand, is more objective. So here's another example of a psychological test. So this is the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And so this questionnaire is like 500 something questions. It's super long, but this is just a snapshot. So it asks them a series of true-false questions, and they're just supposed to be as honest as they can be. But as you can see, some of the questions are kind of weird. Like, I like mechanics magazines. Like, what is that? Well, why are we asking that? Or I like to read newspaper articles on crime. No one seems to understand me. Some of these seem more related to psychology than others. And so that's what I mean by these questions or these instruments kind of get at psychological ideas in a roundabout way. And so there's tons of questions about what are we actually measuring when we use these types of tests. So to kind of make this a little bit more current, I often will take BuzzFeed quizzes just because I think they're ridiculous and funny. Please don't judge me too much. But here's an example of a BuzzFeed quiz that I took. So the BuzzFeed quiz is, which Disney princess are you? You can see my result. And so when we look at the types of questions that these quizzes are asking, they're often in no way actually related to what they're trying to assess. And so, some of these BuzzFeed questions might ask you to pick a condiment for your hot dog. And from that, it tries to predict the type of car you should buy. How is hot dog condiment at all related to car purchases? And so what we're talking about here is issues of reliability and validity. And so your class assignment for this week is related to this, at least part of it. I'm actually going to ask you to do a BuzzFeed quiz and talk about this. And so try to incorporate this in your answer. So when we're talking about reliability, what we're talking about is whether or not the test is consistent over time. Validity, on the other hand, is the extent to which you're measuring what you claim to measure. And so with reliability, what we're trying to determine is if this person took this test multiple times, would they get the same answer? So let's go back to that Disney princess quiz. If I took it today, would I get the same princess? Probably not, right? Because that test isn't very reliable. Same thing with validity. We need to question, is this test actually measuring what we think it's measuring? So if the question that I'm trying to get at is how to pick the best car to buy, does it make sense to ask about hot dog condiment? Well, probably not. So the issue is that the validity is low, right? We're not actually measuring what we're trying to measure. If we're trying to predict car purchases, maybe we should be asking something like, how much money do you have? Do you need four-wheel drive? How many people tend to ride in your vehicle? How environmentally, conscious are you? And so those are the types of questions that would be more appropriate. And so I love this figure down here because this just absolutely hammers it home for me. So if a test is reliable but not valid, it means it's going to be consistent, but it's going to miss the mark. Okay, so reliable means it's very consistent over time, but it's not valid, meaning you're not measuring what you claim to measure, which is the target. This is something with low validity, low reliability, really inconsistent, and you're never really measuring what you're trying to measure. This is another way low reliability and low validity could look, again, kind of all over the place, never really hitting the target. This is a measure that is reliable and valid, consistently hitting the mark. So reliability and validity are two huge issues when we're talking about designing a study, because we want to make sure that the measures we choose are both high reliability and high validity. And so that's what we mean by not all research is created equal. because sometimes researchers make mistakes and use measures that have issues with one or both of these aspects of measurement.